Makosini, it's the best picture we've had of you this whole year so far.
How are you, Mr. Osinga?
I'm well, thank you. And how are you, Mr. Shabangu?
No, that's good. That's good. Are you in Cape Town?
In Malmesbury, which is 70 kilometers north of Cape Town. So yes, from an aerial perspective, I'm in Cape Town, yes.
I don't want to come to Cape Town.
Are you scared?
I'm scared of Corona, man.
Yeah, I know it's really a scary phenomenon, you know, in that it's not something you can see. You know, then they call it a virus, then they call it a bacteria, then they call it a parasite, then it comes through the water, then it comes through the air. So, yeah, it's challenging.
It's everything. No.
It's really, it's not pleasant times. You know, it's so against our nature not to socialize and engage and have interaction. It's it's really.
Let's hope it will pass.
Honorable Makosini. So good to see you not sitting in the car. Happy New Year.
Hey, how are you? How are you, my friend?
I'm good, my brother. How are you?
Hey, mangete nangu. Kunjani mangete?
Baba.
Siyabonga. Hey, tala.
Yeah, nongijabulele ukubona. Happy New Year.
No, happy belated.
Akusese New Year uJanuary akakapheli.
Hayi New Year iphelile. Silanga liwa.
This is the month of New Year.
Oh, yeah.
It's a new season. So
yeah.
Correct, Chairperson. My
brother. Yeah, when uzamsupport Chairperson wakho.
Angimsupporti.
Awumsupporti.
It's a new season. I agree with him.
Mama Ramadwa. Mama.
Good morning, everybody. How are you this morning?
Morning, Chairperson.
Yeah, move on. Look at Comanget. Laptop yakho yanyakaza nje ubuso bakho buyanyakaza.
Yeah, kusho ukuthi ngisaphila.
Imalapho ungasalokho ukuthi uyaphila.
Yeah. Honorable members, how are you?
Excellent, Chair. How are you?
Good.
I'm fine.
Honorable
Ndione Boramadwa. I think we should start our meeting. It's already 9 o'clock, so that we start the year with the right footing. Good morning to everybody. You are heartily welcome to this meeting, which is actually our second meeting because we met yesterday as a committee. And to those who were not part of that meeting because they had apologized, compliment of the new season. I hope we are going to work even harder than last year and ensure that we help our people. Valerie, apologies.
Chair, there's an apology from Ms. Noluchungu that had a bereavement. The funeral is today. And I know Dr. Ngesi is struggling with his laptop audio, so he will join the meeting later.
Everybody's here and the department is ready to can briefly present.
I noticed the department is here. The DG was on the line. a few minutes ago, but I don't see him here now, but the rest of the department is here.
Okay, who's going to briefly present the consideration, deliberations on the this bill, economic bill?
Good morning, Chairperson. I am Temba. If I may speak, I am from the Department of Transport. I am with the team.
Okay, Temba, before you speak, thank you very much. Let's check whether the minister is with us here or the deputy minister.
Good morning, Chairperson. The indication from the Secretariat is that the minister and the DM, they are not invited here, but the department. And then the DG is trying to connect again. Yeah.
Okay. He's still in the Free State.
Okay. DG.
Yeah. I'm just checking.
I don't know, but I just called him to connect. He said he's trying to connect because he was connected before.
Okay, no thanks. Okay, let's allow Temba then to present on behalf of the department. Temba and your team.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, honorable members. One more time. I was just introducing Mr. Sikudo, who will do the presentation on behalf of the department, because I was seeing that the DG has not yet joined. Thank you very much. Through you, Chairperson, if I may hand over to Mr. Sikudo to present. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tenza. Good morning, Honorable Chairperson. Good morning, honorable members, and good morning, colleagues from the Department of Transport, as well as colleagues from Parliament. My name is Mweketi Sikudo, the project manager for the Single Transport Economic Regulator, which is what is called in totality. I had made a presentation in the previous session, and I think, yes, indeed, I'm the correct person to make a presentation from the level of being a project manager. I'll try to screen the presentation as we speak now. I don't know whether you see it.
We don't see any presentation.
Not yet. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Indeed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I will go straight to the presentation itself because I think that is my role today. And the presentation will highlight or discuss in brief issues related to high-level implementation plan, organizational design, financial implications, as well as structural implications. I have noted the fact that in the previous sessions, from the department's point of view, there are three questions which were raised. One relates to the structure of the regulator itself. What are the financial implications related to the introduced regulatory economic framework? What is the structural implications? So really the presentation aims to address those three areas. And the slide here just gives the honorable members the high-level implementation plan, the details of which will be embedded in the business case document. The implementation plan is broadly in three phases. The first one relates to the pre-establishment phase, which is mainly before effective date of the STAIR legislation. The STAIR legislation and the business case must be approved. That's what we aim to achieve as an output there. The second output was the necessary procedures, regulations needed to resource and establish the Transport Economic Regulator, which is the TER there, and the Transport Economic Council, which must be concluded. And this will be concluded when the bill has been enacted through the parliamentary process. The second phase, basically, it's a 3-year phase. And the intention there is to absorb all functions of the existing transport economic regulators, then develop capacity and procedures necessary to achieve the full scope and mandate. And a 5-year plan basically on the last phase, which is the third phase, is to ensure that all modes of the transport sector are regulated, and there's a review of functions which should be performed as envisaged in the bill itself. Secondly, we will ensure that all operational and administrative policies and procedures of the regulator and the council are in place and approved as required by the plan. One of the questions that was raised was, what is the organizational design, or what is the structure that is envisaged for this bill? And the organizational design or institutional arrangement was informed really by 5 guiding principles. The first one relates to the fact that the decisions of the regulator should be challenged, and the Economic Council that I mentioned earlier will be the adjudicative institution wherein complaints and appeals could be channeled for them to be considered. The second issue was to ensure that the institution or the regulator is an independent organ of state. And thirdly, we need to ensure that the entity must be separate from the regulator, from the Economic Council. So you would have an economic regulator as well as the Economic Council. The board, which is the 4th item there, the board will then play the board governance model role and ensure that it is an accounting authority. So there would be separation of functions and powers between the board as well as the regulator itself. And the role of the regulator will be administrative in nature to deal with issues of economic regulation. Then the most important part, which is the last bullet point, is when we set up in this new regulator to consolidate existing regulators, we must ensure that there is little disruption in existing regulators so that the system in totality in the transport sector does not get tampered with, and it does not get to a situation where it collapses and does not operate. That's mainly the guiding principles that informed the institutional arrangement that I'm going to present here. Really, the minister would be key in ensuring that he or she puts in place the board and the council as well. So the board operates separate from the council. The council that I mentioned earlier, it's the adjudication body or the tribunal that we are envisaging, which will look at the appeals and complaints made by the stakeholders within the transport sector. And the board itself will be an accounting authority, which would have about 5-time members to deal with governance issues. And their year of operation will be a 4-year staggered term, renewable once though, which means there would only be in members of the board for a period, maximum period of two phases. Then the experience in economics, law, commerce, and accounting, it's really what would be required for members to be part of this board. Then the board itself will then appoint the CEO, who would then report to the board itself, and the CEO will be the ex-officio board member. And the term of the CEO would be 4 years, renewable ones as well, aligned to the board so that there would be consistent operation of systems and processes there. Then the CEO will be supported by the regulator executives, some of which could be called deputy CEOs and all the stuff. I'll unpack this part in our next slide as to what really means there. So there would be a committee which will operate in a fashion like your monetary policy committee that determines the interest rate of the country. So that committee will make decisions on economic regulatory matters, and the operation and functions of the regulator will then be under the CEO. So this body that I'm talking about would then be reporting to the CEO itself. That's really the envisaged institutional arrangement. In a case where the regulators' decisions are challenged through the council, and the council therefore makes a ruling. However, the stakeholders or the applicants who had made that appeal are adversely affected by the decision made by the council. They have an opportunity to go through the judiciary system to basically appeal the decision that has been made by the council. So that's how the system is. The council basically is trying to limit the costs and time at which the adversely affected stakeholders can deal with their matters before they go to the judiciary system. Then the next slide basically details the structure of the regulator, and I will try not to go through it in detail, but suffice to mention that the regulator would be led by the chief executive officer, who would then be supported in the main by modal economic regulatory experts. And the modes which we are talking about is maritime, aviation, rail, and road. And that team will then be supported by the legal services section and supported by the office of the chief financial officer. And the legal services, which is a core common component that would have to support the regulator, would have a component that deals with regulatory legal matters as well as administrative matters. So at a high level, basically, we would have about 6 deputy CEO, if I can say it that way, lack of a better word for now, who would then be supporting the regulator, the regulatory CEO in terms of the structure that we are envisaging for the regulator itself. It's quite a huge structure. I will talk to the number of posts and all the stuff as to what we are anticipating with regard to this structure. Let me come to the summary of the establishment itself in terms of posts. The share or the ratio in which we're looking at with respect to core services and support services at an initial stage, which is interim column, we're looking at having 80% of core staff as well as 20% of support staff, which is at the initial stage. And then when the regulator is fully functional and fully fledged, we're looking at the core staff to be 70%, and the support services staff would be 30%. In real terms, what we are anticipating is that the Office of the Chief Financial Officer at the initial stage would comprise of 13 staff members, and when it is fully fledged, will comprise of 22 members. And the office that relates to matters related to economic regulation, initially we anticipate about 42 staff members, and when it is rolled out in the next 2 to 3 years, we anticipate 72 staff members will be working on economic regulation related matters. That's really what we anticipated. So in total, we anticipate that at the initial stage, there would be 78 employees vis-a-vis 134 employees in the 5-year period that we're looking at. I won't go much on this slide. Suffice to say that the Office of the CEO's salary gradings will be in relation to the public service regulations, as well as his or her staff, and the remuneration of the board and the council will be in relation to the Treasury guidelines and Treasury regulations. What we are anticipating, as an example, for the CEO's grading, it will be at the public service level of 16, which is really the level of the DG and above. That's what we are anticipating then. And then in terms of the summary budget, what we have done, this assessment was basically done around 2019-20, and the base year period that we're looking at using the summary of economic classification, in 2018-2019, we're looking at projecting a budget of 99 million for the transport economic regulator there. And for the year 2022, we're looking at 108 million that we are predicting that will be the required budget for the regulator itself. And the compensation of the council, which we are using the Treasury regulations and guidelines, at base year 18-19, we were sitting at 444,000, And at 21-22, we would be sitting at 520,000. So really, in total, the budget of the council and the budget of the regulator would be 100 million, just over 100 million. That is the base year. And then 21-22, we're looking at 108 million for that. And going forward, there are proposed budgets that would be predicted for the regulator itself. In terms of the share of the total budget as to how much goes to which category, we're looking at the economic regulation functions taking much of the budget of the regulator, which is about 54%, followed by finance and corporate services, which finance and corporate services relates to legal services, and that key component that I spoke about that relates to economic regulation, which will then be followed by the office of the chief executive officer, which is about 14%, and lastly is 12% by legal. That's really the share of the budget that we are anticipating for the economic regulator. Financial implications, which is an important point that has been made in the agenda of the portfolio committee for today, has looked at 3 areas to respond to this question as to what is the implication in real terms with regard to this project. And one model we look at is the regulatory impact analysis. And what we then looked at, which you will see in the next slide, it's a summary of the budget of the regulator that is anticipated there, but it will be reflected here as well. Then that area of focus is the current cost of economic regulators vis-a-vis what we are anticipating for the economic regulator. Coming to the first one, which is the regulatory impact analysis that we have done. And the impact analysis was on the basis of the computational geometrical economic model, which is called CGE. Then the impact of introducing the proposed economic regulatory framework indicates that at a low cost scenario, which is 2019-2020, we were looking at the cost to be about 97.9 million. Then at a high cost scenario, we were looking about 120 million, which roughly reflects to the previous slides that I have spoken to. But at high level, the potential wide economic regulatory impact of this framework would be adding to the GDP baseline of 2019 about 3.5 billion to the fiscals or to the economic revenue. But there are 4 areas in which this economic regulatory framework would impact to. The first one relates to the transport margins. That's basically the transport cost that begins from the producer and ends at the purchaser. It shows that the transport cost would decline by 5%, particularly for state-owned entities, which really is a positive matter there. Then secondly, it shows that there would be an increase of about 1% inefficiency, which would then influence or affect the increase in investment that you would show below there, which is also about 1%. In total, the transport cost reduction would be about 5%. And this block, which is on the bottom part of the slide, bottom left part of the slide, relates to the transport cost within the production phase of companies, wherein goods are then bought from the suppliers to make other goods so that it can be transported to the purchase as well. So in summary, I would then indicate that there is a serious positive impact using the regulatory impact analysis and the CGE modeling to the economy with the reduction of transport cost, which is an important matter, the increase in efficiency, which then affects the increase in investment, and there would be a total reduction in transport cost. That's really the impact of this program that we're looking at now. Then the phase that I have mentioned, it's looking at the current cost of economic regulators in the transport sector. What we are looking at here, the first column shows you the current existing economic regulators, which is your port regulator, the Ports Regulator of South Africa, Cross-Border Road Transport Agency, Regulating Committee, National Public Transport Regulator, the Air Services Licensing Council, which is a domestic licensing council that licenses airplanes, the International Air Services Council, which licenses the access to the international market, as well as the interim rail economic regulatory capacity. Those are the current existing economic regulators. And the base year which we looked at was 2017-2018. And at that period, we realized that the budget at the time was just above 248 million. And the actual spend was about 260 million. What we then projected for the next 3 years, I'll move away from this column. We projected that at year 21-22, the budget for those respective economic regulators in the transport sector would be above 323 million. On average, we looked at having 277 million that was budgeted for all these regulators. In comparison to stay at base year, we're looking at just over 80 million, which is way below the current economic regulators that we have, which was budgeted at about 240 million. So just to be in short here is to indicate that the envisaged average budget for the STAIR, which is the transport economic regulator that we're talking about, would be above 98 million rand, which is a huge saving with respect to the current economic regulator's current budget that is envisaged here. So we see the introduction of the framework of economic regulation to save the state and the economy a lot of money. Obviously, one can do percentages as to how much percentage would have been saved here, which is something that we can do outside the meeting here. Then in real terms, we then say, what are the options for revenue generation for the economic regulator? So we have identified about 3 options. One is that it is a known fact that the regulator that you envisage should be independent, and therefore independent financing is critical for this body. So hence mechanisms would be looked at to ensure that the body itself will finance itself on a long-term basis. But it is unavoidable that at an initial stage or in short term, the institution will depend on the fiscus, and there are serious engagements that have been taking place with the National Treasury, basically see how best they can fund this institution at the beginning. And the principles of how fees are charged will be as follows. There will be concurrency with the Minister of Finance. There would be an overall money collected in line with the needs of the STAIR Council and the actual cost of regulation. This point really says the institution within the transport sector that benefits from the economic regulatory framework that would have been put in place should then also pay for some of these functions. And these functions will then be disaggregated as per the economic regulator and the council itself. So the work that is huge that would be focused in the economic regulator itself will then have to be funded by these entities as well, which would be public entities as well as private sector entities. There will be checks and balances to ensure that the regulator is as efficient as possible in completing the regulatory task. And the regulation is only undertaken where it improves the economic outcomes. Basically, the idea is to ensure that the entities which are regulated and benefiting from the work of the institution do provide some part funding for this institution. And in terms of one critical question was raised as well was, what would be the structural arrangement in terms of the existing economic regulators, as well as how do we anticipate to phase in this process? At high level, honorable members, please note that the approach here is not being banned. There would be a phase-in approach to incorporate all the economic regulators into the single transport economic regulator. The first phase would look at using the port regulator of South Africa as a nucleus to set up the STAIR. So the STAIR won't be started from a zero base. It will be based from the current existing regulator, which is the port regulator of South Africa. And it will be then supported by the current regulatory committee functions and processes and systems that we have. Then the third item that we would have to do on the first phase is to introduce economic regulatory capacity in the rail sector. Currently, we have a capacity that we call IREC. It is meant for interim regulatory economic regulator capacity. So that capacity is in place and is functioning. It is developing frameworks for the economic regulator for the rail sector, and that function, those functions and processes will be fused into the regulator itself. So in the rail sector as well, as much as we currently don't have a legal body that conducts independent regulation, but we currently have an interim capacity that has been built for the last 2-3 years by the department itself. So that information and those functions and those experiences will then be transferred to the economic regulator. The second phase, basically, of the strategy, which is a 3-year phase, will then introduce other licensing capacities. I have mentioned issues of the domestic licensing council as well as the international licensing councils, which will then be fused into the process. What basically this statement means, it means in the first phase of the single framework of economic regulation, the focus will be on determination of tariffs, prices, and so forth. And then the second phase will then move towards the licensing capacity where accessibility to different markets is provided. And the third phase, which is a 5-year program, obviously, all of these phases can work in parallel. It will be the focus on the public transport related economic regulators, which is the National Public Transport Regulator, as well as the Cross-Border Road Transport Agency. That's really the 3-pronged approach that the department is looking at to avoid the ping-pong approach, which could collapse the system should one institution not operate there. So we want to avoid such a disaster that could happen. In conclusion and in summary, at inception, it is estimated that the STAIR project will include both the Transport Economic Regulator as well as the board and the Transport Economic Council, which will then cost at a reaching amount of 101 million and increase at a highest amount of 104.7 million in 3 years' time. Currently, the business case is being finalized, and the National Treasury is being engaged to finalize the business case. The business case would have the implementation plan in detail, as I have mentioned earlier in my presentation. And the next stage, though, would be to rationalize all economic regulators into STAIR, which will be phased in the 3-pronged approach instead of a ping-pong-bang approach. Honorable Chairperson, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let's get questions, clarity questions from members. Thank you very much, sir. Let me check. Honorable Lawrence McDonald's hand is up, followed by Honorable Stolle. Who else wants to speak? Only those 2 hands for now. Or Honorable Chris Hunsinger. Let's take those hands in that order. Bonus Togos and Fonishwa will be the last. Right?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you for the presentation from the department. I do have just one comment and one question, Chair. I will keep it short. As it's a new year, I don't want to make long stories. Chair, the document that was circulated to the Portfolio Committee was dated the 1st of December 2020. The document that was presented, although exactly the same, was dated differently. Chair, this has become a committee, a regular thing in this committee. The documents submitted and the documents presented are not the same. Chair, Chair, this needs to end. That's my last comment on that, Chair. And then, Chair, on the slide, let me just get the right slide number here, Chair. On the financial implications, it says the current cost of economic regulators to the transport and the CBRT. they've got an average, they've got there on the 2017-2018, they have got a budget and actual of 221,408,000 rand. But Chair, if I go and I open the financial annual report of the CBRTA on their page 31 of their slide of the 2019-2020 document, or 2018-2019 document, they also reflect the 2017-2018 financials, and there they've got a surplus of 57 million rand, Chair. Now, I'm very concerned, Chair, is the one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, or am I reading this wrong, or can I be clarified, Chair? I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Baba Stole. Mondis.
Chairperson. Honorable Chairperson, first of all, we must thank the presenter for his presentation. But there's some clarification that I need to pose on him. The first one, if you check, there is the document talking about the council 4 to 7 part-time members, and at the same time we talk about 5 ex-official board members. If you can clarify that one, the difference between these 4 to 7 part-time council and then the ex-official. And the other one, Chairperson, I'm worried about the huge number of CEO. Why do we have 6 CEO, triple CEO? What's the reason of having so many triple CEO, Chairperson? And the other one, Chairperson, I'm trying to check if you can unpack the 2 principles, which is concurrency of the Minister of Finance required, which is required. If you can unpack that one, and the overall amount of money collected, which it says is in line with the need of the star or council and actually cost of regulators. If you can pack all that one, Chairperson, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Honsinga.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you to Mr. Sekudo for his presentation and the preparation thereof, and thank you for addressing the questions thematically which we raised last time, and the focus then in this presentation on the financial implications. Chairperson, to kick off, right at the beginning at slide 4, it was shown that there would be a distinction between the TER regulator and the TE council. And I regard it as a very novel ambition to make the statement that these 2 functions, that of the regulator and that of the council, should be independent of the state, and in fact 2 independent organs of the state as shown in slide 4. How would this novel ambition be achieved if the minister makes these appointments? However could the functioning thereof be independent? My second remark relates to the financial statements and budget figures that are shown in the table, which my colleague Honorable MacDonald has already used one example of. I went through most of those, and they are definitely not aligned to the actual budget figures. And I would submit that we cannot rely on that table at all as being reflective of the point in a huge saving through the establishment of the Transport Economic Regulator. It fails to prove that point, given the fact that there is a misalignment to the true budgets of each of those entities shown, especially if you also align them to slide number 13, where a whole list of entities are shown, and obviously, you know, all those budgets need to be shown to then determine a real cost saving. Chairperson, then a very direct and overarching question related to this point between slide 4 and slide 13 of a cost saving in budget in establishing the economic regulator. Would this mean taking away functions from the current regulators? So at the end of the day, which of the current regulators would then disappear, and what implications would there be for that in job losses? Because certainly a point of cost saving cannot be made in another way as to also explain the implications of employment. How many staff is envisaged to be transferred to this new entity opposed to the suggestion of a number of new appointments? So the financial implication then most certainly relates very closely to how the shifts would happen between the entities in this aspiration of establishing a new entity. There are a number of entities in slide 13 which is not familiar to me, and then others that I wonder about. I do not see the railway safety regulator in that list on slide 13, and I also don't see Transnet, but it might be that IRERC would cover those. So could you please clarify that aspect? In your slide number 12, there is a suggestion around a reduction in cost on all SOE transport modes of 5%, and your explanation around this alluded to involvement in the procurement processes. Could you clarify whether the regulator would then in fact get its fingers in the procurement processes of different modes of transport, and in that way explain the 5% saving, or was it just a wild example that you used around procurement? I still have the 3 overarching questions, Chairperson, and the overarching questions relate to how would regulation actually happen? Once the regulator is established, that I'm quite positive of in terms of having a single regulator. I've always been positive and in favor of this. But then the difference is around how the regulation will happen. So to give us some insight as to how you foresee this regulation will actually happen in practical terms, specifically versus the competitive market-driven mechanisms, and also the importance of establishing private-public partnerships. My second overarching question, Chairperson, is around the priority of this bill, which brings me to the last one. Is this really the most important bill that we should invest in currently, given our economic situation, but then most importantly, the terrible state of our transport sector, especially public transport as such? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Hunsinger. Asithokoze Mhlonishwa.
Ngithokoze, Chairperson, ngithokoze to you for the opportunity, and ngithokoze to all of my colleagues. Chair, I think some of my questions have largely been covered by colleagues, but perhaps let me just rephrase a few of them, so that perhaps maybe I can get clarity on some of the issues which have been raised. I think first and foremost, the motivation that there would be a cost saving is actually a welcome one. I think that is something that we welcome, and also it seems like there's going to be a huge cost saving. However, my colleagues asked a few questions, especially Honorable Chris Hunsinger. If you look at slide 13, CBRTA is seemingly the one with the most, the largest budget. And therefore, the question now arises to say the staff at CBRTA, will they thus be collapsed into, if you look at slide number 7, into one of the into one of the entities under the new structure on the organizational design. If that's the case, I think my colleague asked this question to say, will there be an integration with staff which will be absorbed? And if there will be an integration, what process will be followed? Will staff simply be taken and be collapsed under one of the directorates within the organizational design and structure which we see here? And if that is the case, seeing that CBRTA has actually the largest budget, that also speaks to the fact that perhaps one of the biggest casualties in terms of if there would be job losses would be CBRTA. Now, if you look at it as well, all these regulators have boards. Now, they have spoken about, I think the only board that we have here would be the regulator board and also a council. Now, will some of the existing board members from other from the current existing regulators, will they form part of the 5 part-time members, or will there be a complete new recruitment process for the regulators for the board, and also some of the council members, which maximum can be 7, as it states here that they will be sourced from all men of backgrounds, economics, law and accounting, and obviously also transport. Will they also be sourced from the same existing regulators which are there? And also, if we go then to, that's slide 7. Okay, I've covered that. Look, I think, as I said, Chair, in my opening remarks, the motivation for cost saving is actually one that is something that we could perhaps look at it, because in terms of cost saving, looking at the current numbers, the startup people are looking at perhaps 120 million rands versus the current 277 million rands, which amounts to a significant amount of saving. So I think that on its own is welcome, but I think also the principle, which perhaps is something that must not be ignored, is the fact that we need a regulator that will obviously be an independent organ of state, as they have, as they envisage here, but also a board which would be in a position to actually oversee and play a good oversight role in terms of the STER, and also to ensure that all of the regulators which have been collapsed under this organizational design would actually continue to serve a purpose, and that they would actually be in a position to still fulfill their roles as it is envisaged in terms of how they were established. But also, just last question. So therefore, that means we're going to collapse all of these regulators into a single entity. And if that's the case, what is the process? Because I believe all the boards currently and the regulators have contracts in place, and also they have terms which are there. What will thus happen? Will they be terminated? If they'll be terminated, what's the process that will be followed? And I think the big one for me is actually the staff in terms of the integration, because you wouldn't want a situation where the guys which were in the other regulators end up losing their jobs. But also, you don't want to take everyone. You want to ensure that you take people who are fit for purpose in terms of merits and everything else that would actually serve this well. With that said, Chair, thank you so much. You are on mute, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for that, Mhlonishwa. I believe these were the Only hands that I had, yes. Let me revert back to Ndate Sikudo and your team. Mr. Sikudo?
Oh, yes, Chair, I'm here. I will take you through the response in a moment. I'm trying to, okay, here we go. Okay. Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, honorable members, particularly around the comments which have been made, most of which were helping the project itself going forward. I'll try to consolidate some of these questions in my response, because I think there are high-level questions which one could respond using the slides. Please bear with me. I will try to provide as much details as possible. I think I would probably not highlight many of the questions raised by each honorable member, but capture those, because most of the questions relates to cost saving, relates how will this work, relates to issues related to how do you distinguish between the TER as well as the TEC. It relates to the fact that this project, does it really mean a existed listed economic regulators? And there was a question around, I don't see other regulators which are kept up there. So I will highlight the response with regard to the framework that I have highlighted. First point that we need to highlight, Honorable Chair, is the area around the design of the structure itself. I think there are a number of questions that have been raised there. I think maybe if you can spend 1 or 2 minutes on this structure, maybe it will address most of the questions. I think there was a question around the fact that we need to distinguish between the economic regulator, which is this part. I don't know whether you can see my cursor, which is the part skewed to the left, which starts with a regulator board, and it has 5-time members. Can you see the Chair? Okay, let me proceed. The regulator board would have 5-time members. Those would be recruited through a process of analyzing and checking their experience and qualifications and so forth to be able to be considered to be part of the board itself. And the board will then be reporting to the minister. I know there was a question of independence, which I'll address now. So the regulator will deal with administrative functions and processes and systems related to economic regulation. And there was a question around how, in practical terms, economic regulation will happen after the bill has been enacted. I'll just make an example, which is currently happening with regard to the Ports Regulator of South Africa. What happens at the current moment is that the Transnet, the Transnet National Ports Authority and National Ports Terminals basically report to the Ports Regulator of South Africa with regard to economic regulation. So what then Transnet does, it will then submit its application to the regulator for tariffs to be determined for specific subsectors within the maritime. What would then happen, the regulator itself look at the information from Transnet, it will then consider whether to approve the price, the application of Transnet, or determine otherwise. So the most important thing on the information submitted by Transnet, it will then be considered by the regulator, which will then determine as to how much it will cost to move a container from point A to point B, which is exactly what the regulator would do, because in the absence of the regulator, Transnet would then have the opportunity to put up prices which would be unfair to transport the container in this example. So the duty of the regulator itself will be determine the movement of that container in that specific area. That's exactly what the regulator will do. But what then could happen is that the the regulator will then have to ensure that it enforces the implementation of the Act. Without the enforcement agency, the Act would not be practical. Therefore, the second most important role of the regulator will ensure that it basically enforces the Act itself. And the board, it's a part-time body, part-time committee members like any other board, and it will play a governance role to ensure the governance functions and judiciaries apply in this institution. Then the regulator itself, which is distinct from operations of itself, would then deal with issues of administration, issues of economic regulation, and so forth. The council itself, it's a semi-tribunal that we are putting in place to listen to complaints against the decisions of the regulator or to appeal the decisions of the regulator. So we see this committee of 4 to 5 part-time people, which will be appointed more or less with the same process of appointing the board, because these are part-time members which would be paid through the Treasury regulations. This would be a separate independent tribunal to deal with complaints and deal with appeals. So yes, issues of independence could be argued from a side of saying, if the minister appoints the board, appoints the council, there isn't distant independency there. But practically, we foresee these two institutions working away from each other, but supporting the sector in ensuring that there's economic regulation in the sector itself. That's really the issue around the differences between the two, and the role is so different where the board and its regulator, they enforce the Act itself, and the council listens to appeals as well as complaints that would have been made by applicants within the economic regulation space. I think there was a question around why so many chief executive officers. I would assume the question was in relation to this section. If not, I would break it into two parts. I would then say that the chief executive officer is only one who would lead the institution and ensure that the regulator itself functions. And the chief executive officer would then be supported by a member who would be focusing on communication and stakeholder relations, a member who would be focusing on complaints, as well as the company secretary who would do the normal administration duties for the regulator and supported by the risk manager. But in reality, there's only one chief executive officer, which would then be supported by these employees who are directly reporting to the CEO. These employees relate to blocks that relates to legal services, maritime economic regulation, aviation economic regulation, rail economic regulation, road economic regulation, and chief financial officer and corporate services. We've collapsed these two areas into one. So lack of a better word now, but in our bill, we seem to be referring to deputy CEOs. Basically, these are executive management that would be reporting directly to the CEO itself. And really, that's the response with regard to why are we having many CEOs. The answer is we don't have many CEOs. We have one CEO who would be supported by executive managers below him or her. I think there was a question around the fact that CBRTA has made a surplus of 78 million, and that's according to the financial report of CBRTA. It is unfortunate that I can't comment on the statement because I don't have information before me, but the analysis that I have made with regard to the implications, financial implications of these projects, didn't actually go to detailed level of checking whether we have surpluses or we have deficits in the number of years that I have assessed. There was a question, I'll come to the issues around 3 overarching questions, which is, I think for me, it's the gist of the discussion here. But there was a question around, when we consolidate economic regulators, do we mean the collapse of the existing regulators? And what would then happen to the staff that would be employed by those regulators, particularly CBRTA, which seem to have the biggest budget, and therefore their employees which would be affected. I think the honest answer to give you there hasn't been a phase in which we look at the issues of HR, labor relations, and operation levels, because that's the next phase of this project. The first phase was indeed to make sure that we get the bill developed, finalized, and then get it gazetted to become an act. In parallel, we then develop regulations. As we speak now, we have some regulations that we have developed. We have then developed a business case that gives a high-level implementation plan as to how we're going to roll out this plan. The real phase, or the next phase that we are going to embark on, is to look at the detailed information that relates to HR-related matters, the number of staff that would be affected, and how we would then have to consult staff as to how to consolidate each. But at high level, which then answers the next question as to, are you consolidating everything that we have, which is listed there? The answer is yes. And all of these will be collapsed under the last row, which is the STER, which we call it Transport Economic Regulator, according to the bill, where the project itself is called the Single Transport Economic Regulator. So all of these won't exist when we now have the STER operational. Obviously, we are of the view, like you have noted, honorable members, that there will be implications in terms of resources. For example, where is this entity will be located? A decision is yet to be made. How many staff members would be consolidated? That I've given you the number of staff that we are anticipating in terms of number of posts. The anticipation is that in total, at the initial stage, there would be 78 staff that would be needed for this regulator. So the question is, what number of staff are existing within the regulators that we have identified, and which ones will then be migrated into the in the interim, and how do you then fully fledged implement the structure that we have identified? So I wouldn't want to discuss the issues around labor relations and the number of staff further than that, because an proper analysis has not been done, Chair, with regard to that. I think there was a question around the defining of the impact to the economy of the introduction of the single framework for economic regulation. And there was a question that relates to would the department or the regulator itself be part of the procurement process?
Mr. Skombo?
Yes, Chair.
As you look on the other side, we lose a bit of your voice.
Oh, sorry about that. I'll try to be. It's just that I was looking at some of the questions, but I'll try to be steady. Okay, thanks, Chair.
You can rather pause a moment and look at them and come back and talk to the mic.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think in response to the questions around the cost saving for the transport cost savings, which relates to 5%, which is the first top left block, which you see on my slides, and it talks to decline in transport margins. And these numbers that you see on those 4 blocks, they were developed through a CG modeling, which projects the kind of economic impact this kind of a project would have. At a high level, we mentioned that about 3.5 billion would contribute towards the GDP that we used as a base of 2019. That was the anticipation when we did this analysis. In unpacking that amount, we then said there would be a transport cost reduction of about 5%, and there would be an increase in efficiency of 1%, similarly to the fact that investment will then increase by 1%. This is a modeling tool that was used to project what would be the impact of this project at high level. We will not get involved in the procurement processes of entities, whether it's private entities or SOEs. That's not the role of the department, as well as the regulator. It is not tasked, according to the bill, to participate in those processes. And maybe I have raised that issue by mistake, but that issue basically does not appear at all. I think maybe let's zoom into a question of cost savings. Yes, members are alluding to the fact that, one, given the issues around the surplus of about 78 million of CBRTA, given the fact that some of the figures highlighted here are possibly different to what the honorable members have in front of them, I think the table here gives projections, except column 2 of the year 2017-18. When you look at column 2 of the year 2017-18, those are the actual numbers that we determine at the time. Whereas the column that relates to MTAF budget, these are estimates or projections that we have noticed. And what I have listened to, the numbers that have been listed as we discussed now, they may not reduce this figure tremendously. We would still have a saving that would be brought about by the existence of the single transport economic regulator. Maybe this table would have to now look at amending it with the current figures that we have, because this assessment was done in 2018-19, which the base year is 2017-18. So these numbers could change, but we don't foresee these numbers changing tremendously. And we all of the view or understand that there would be some casualties, which I don't want to dwell much, as earlier indicated, with regard to number of employees, with regard to the resources. Because now, for example, we'll have one office. We could have satellite offices. A decision has not been made as yet, as we're finalizing the business case, and the next phase we'll be looking at issues related to that. So, answer in high level, the collapse of these regulators would then mean most of the staff will be fused into the transport economic regulator. That's really the gist of this, which we anticipated there would be savings when we put in place this system or model, but also over and above the cost savings. That is not so much the focus of this economic regulation. We would have economic regulation across the transport sector, which would be uniform and standardly applied. Obviously, there would be nuances for different modes of transport. I think, let me come as my final conclusion, Chair, in the response that I have made. There were overarching questions raised with relation to the priority of the bill, as well as the fact that is this the most important bill that should be considered given the current situation of the economy. Beginning with the last point, this project has been identified by the presidency and the department as key to contribute towards economic recovery plan that has been approved and announced. So from the department's point of view, this project is quite critical, not so much to make sure that it would be standardization of economic regulation in the sector, but have shown the anticipated contribution that would be derived from this project in the GDP of the country. And secondly, we would like to pursue or request the honorable members to indeed consider processes in this bill. Lastly, the priorities of the bill with respect to the content of what is anticipated of the bill is that, one, is to determine prices, ensure market access. Two, is to ensure enforcement issues related to economic regulation. And three, to ensure that there is a forum or a house wherein appeals and complaints are made, because we don't have such forums, and which results to entities going directly to the judges or to the magistrate to complain against decisions which would have been made in isolation and in disorderly manner. And lastly, from my side here, is the fact that the focus of the bill is on economic regulators, which then excludes safety regulators that relates to rail safety regulators, SAMSA, Civil Aviation Authority, and all that stuff. The focus is only on economic regulation, and safety regulators are excluded from this process. I thank you, Chair. I hope I've covered many of the questions raised. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sikudo. Thank you for the presentation and your effort to answer our questions. Members, we are going to step off this item and allow members to digest. We will discuss and amend what we want to amend on this economic regulation bill, transport bill, next week. Otherwise, from the department, Mr. Sikudo, I believe that the DG could not be successful in connecting. Am I correct?
I am here, Chair.
You are here, DG. Okay,
Yes,
let me allow you then. Let me thank you with your team, unless you have something to say, for presenting. Your team represented you well. I'm sure you have heard that. Otherwise, we want to step on this item. A step off on this item. Do you have anything to say?
No, Chair. I think Mr. Sikudo has answered all the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think you are liberated. Keep on wearing masks and sanitizing, social distancing. Thank you. Members, we shall discuss this matter next week. Otherwise, let's go to item number 3. Item number 3 is considerations of further submissions on the Civil Aviation Amendment Bill and the information of the date of the public hearings. Valerie?
Chair, in the action document on the Civil Aviation Bill, it was forwarded to members. Advocate Nell compiled the comments from the stakeholders because the submissions related to amendments beyond the scope of the bill. The committee published the proposed amendments that were specific to amendment beyond the scope of the bill, and the comments were received on them from the similar stakeholders that were submitting comments in the first round of the advert on the bill. So, Chair, in terms of the process forward, as discussed yesterday, the committee has to agree on the dates for the public hearings, which I proposed yesterday for the morning of 16th and 17th February. It's important that that date be confirmed today because in terms of Parliament process, once the committee agree on the date, we have to approach House Chair for permission to conduct the public hearings on those dates. And obviously the stakeholders need to be invited so that we give them sufficient time for preparation for the hearings.
Thank you very much, honorable members. Are we agreeable to those dates? Let me see a mover and a seconder. I can see the hand of Honorable McDonald is up.
Chair, my hand was up earlier, actually, before you closed the previous item, but it is what it is. But I move for the adoption of your proposals, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Honorable McDonald. And your hand is now removed. Any seconder?
Chairperson Prasoon Singh, I second.
Thank you very much, Honorable Honsinga. There is a member with a very strong voice.
I was just going to second it. Now it has been second. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, honorable members.
Sorry, colleague.
Come again.
No, I just apologize to member Mabangu. I didn't know he wanted to second.
Yeah. Honorable members, let's go to the next item. The next item shall be consideration and adoption of minutes of the proceedings. Minutes that I have seen is the minutes of the 24th and the 25th of November. Am I correct, Valerie?
That's correct, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. I've gone through those minutes myself. If members have seen any issue to be corrected, let's correct so that we can adopt. If there is no correction, for the minutes of the 24th of November, any taker?
Chair, Honourable MacDonald, I move for the adoption of the minutes.
Honourable MacDonald, thank you very much. That is the minutes of the 24th. Any seconder, Honourable Manu?
I second the Chairperson.
Thank you very much for that. Any matters arising, or maybe any matters arising from the minutes of the 24th of November? Nothing. Okay. Let's move to the minutes of the 25th of November 2020. Any proposal to adopt?
I move for the adoption of the minutes.
That is Honorable KP Sitole. Any seconder?
Seconded, Chair, Honourable MacDonald.
Honorable MacDonald has seconded the minutes of the 25th of November. Any other item on the agenda? On my agenda, that was the last item.
Chair, if I may, if you want to give me a please. In terms of the program, I just want to update the committee that this morning an application was submitted to House Chair for the committee to meet on the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 10th of February for deliberations on the ERT bill. As soon as I have a response, the committee will be informed of the outcome.
Thank you very much. That was under any other item? No, that was under announcements. Thank you very much, Valerie. Honorable members, thank you very much for the deliberations and all the attendees and the public stakeholders and those media people who were here with the committee, officials, the department. Let me take this opportunity then to bring this meeting to its logical conclusion. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned. You can go home and do other things.
I'm left.
Why at home? Which home must we go to?
No, but your background is saying you are in Parliament. Thank you very much. Thank you.